Most people think they know what happens after death in Greek mythology. A dark place, a quiet ending, maybe nothing at all. But what if I told you that for the ancient Greeks, death wasn't the end? It was just the beginning of a long, slow, and strangely unsettling journey. Because according to their beliefs, the moment you died, you didn't just disappear. You woke up, confused, cold, standing at the edge of a river you had never seen before, with something watching you from the other side. And the most disturbing part, everyone, rich or poor, kind or cruel, had to take the same journey. No shortcuts, no escape, just a silent boat, a waiting figure, and a world beneath the earth that almost no one ever returned from. So, imagine this with me for a second. You're lying there, maybe in your bed, maybe somewhere quiet, maybe somewhere you didn't expect to be your last place, and everything just slowly fades. Not dramatically, not like in movies. It's actually weirdly calm. Your breathing gets softer, your body feels heavier, and then nothing. But here's the part most people don't think about. What if nothing isn't actually nothing? Because in Greek mythology, the moment you die isn't the end of your awareness. It's the beginning of a very strange kind of waking up. You don't vanish. You don't disappear. Instead, you realize you're still there, still thinking, still aware, but something feels off. You try to move your hand, and it doesn't respond. You try to speak, but no sound comes out. And then slowly, almost too slowly, you notice something that makes everything feel colder than it should be. Your body is still lying there, but you're not inside it anymore. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. According to the ancient Greeks, your soul, what they called the psyche, doesn't just float away peacefully. It lingers just for a little while, long enough to see what's happening, long enough to hear people around you, crying, calling your name, touching your body, but you can't respond. And that's the first shocking truth most people never hear about. Greek mythology, death wasn't instant separation, it was awareness without control. Imagine being fully conscious, but completely unable to interact with the world. That alone is already more disturbing than anything Hollywood usually shows. And it gets worse, because the longer you stay in that state, the more distant everything feels. Voices stretch, time slows, reality becomes thinner, like you're slipping out of it, layer by layer. And then comes the moment that changes everything. It's subtle, almost easy to miss. The world around you, your room, the people, the sound starts to fade, not like turning off a light, but like a memory slowly losing detail, and in its place, something else begins to form. A different kind of space, colder, quieter, not empty but not alive either. And this is where the Greeks believed your real journey begins. Because here's the second shocking fact. You don't choose to move on. You are pulled, not violently, not suddenly but inevitably, like gravity. But for your soul, you feel it gently at first, like a current you didn't notice before, guiding you somewhere you've never been. And deep down, even if you don't understand it yet, you already know where this is going. You're not going back. You're not waking up. You're being taken somewhere else entirely. And this is the part I want you to really sit with, because it's kind of chilling in a quiet way. In Greek belief, death didn't judge you immediately. It didn't punish you right away. It didn't even explain anything to you. It simply moved you forward. No instructions, no guide, no comforting voice telling you what's next. Just you, your thoughts, and this slow, unstoppable transition into something unknown. And honestly, that might be the most unsettling part of all. Not pain, not fear, but the silence. Because when there's nothing telling you what's happening, your mind starts filling in the gaps, and that's where the journey truly begins. So, let's stay in that moment a little longer, because this is where things get strangely uncomfortable in a quiet way. You're still aware, but now the world you knew is slipping further away, like it's being erased piece by piece. And here's something most people don't realize about Greek mythology. They didn't believe your soul instantly understood what was happening. There was no clarity, no sudden enlightenment, no voice saying you've passed on. Instead, they imagined something much more human, confusion. You would still think like yourself, still feel like yourself, but nothing would respond the way it used to, and that creates a kind of quiet panic, not loud or dramatic, but slow and creeping, like when you wake up in a place you don't recognize, and for a few seconds, nothing makes sense. That's the state they believed every single person experienced, no matter who they were in life. Kings, warriors, ordinary people, it didn't matter. Death leveled everyone into the same fragile, uncertain awareness. And here comes one of the more unsettling details that rarely gets talked about. According to some ancient beliefs, the soul didn't immediately leave the body completely. For a brief time, it hovered close enough to see, close enough to feel the presence of the physical world, but unable to reconnect with it. Imagine trying to step back into your own body and realizing it's like a locked door you can't open anymore. That's a very different kind of fear, right? Not being chased, not being attacked, just being separated from something that used to be you. And the Greeks leaned into this idea deeply. They believed ritual, funerals, and proper burials weren't just traditions. They were necessary to help the soul finally move on. Without them, the soul might linger longer than it should. That's the shocking part. Your journey after death didn't just depend on you. It depended on what the living did for you after you were gone. If they forgot, or if you were left unburied, your soul could become stuck in that in-between state, unable to continue forward. Now picture this shift happening more clearly. The voices fade, the room disappears, and suddenly you're no longer somewhere familiar. You're somewhere else entirely, but it's not like stepping into a new place. It's more like realizing you've already been there for a while without noticing. That's how subtle the transition is described. And here's another quiet but powerful detail. The Greeks didn't describe this moment as terrifying in a loud sense. They described it as empty, and that emptiness does something to the mind. When there are no sounds, no distractions, no movement, your thoughts become louder, memories come back in fragments, regrets feel heavier, questions start looping in your head, and because there's no one there to answer them, they just stay with you. That's something a lot of people don't expect when they think about ancient myth, psychological side of it. It wasn't just about monsters or gods. It was about what it feels like to be alone with your own mind when everything else is gone. And then, slowly, something begins to guide you, even if you don't see it at first. Not a figure, not a voice, just a direction, like your surroundings are subtly shifting, leading you somewhere without you choosing it. And here's the next shocking idea. You don't resist it, not because you can't, but because part of you already understands that this is how it works now. The rules have changed. The world you knew no longer applies, and that realization, even if it's not fully conscious, changes the way you move, the way you think, the way you exist in that moment. You begin to follow that pull, not out of trust, but because there's nothing else to do, no alternatives, no turning back, just forward. And this is where the tone of the entire journey is set, not with fear, not with chaos, but with something much quieter, inevitability. The Greeks didn't imagine death as something you fight. They imagined it as something you slowly understand, step by step, as it unfolds around you. And honestly, That might be what makes it so unsettling, because there's no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. No point where you feel in control again. Just this slow realization that whatever comes next has already started, and you're already part of it. Alright, so by now, you've already felt that shift, right? That quiet pull away from everything familiar. And this is where the ancient Greeks start to get very specific about what comes next. Because according to Greek mythology, your journey doesn't stay abstract for long. It leads you somewhere real in their imagination, but described in such detail that it almost feels like a memory you forgot. And that place is a river. Not just any river, but one that every single soul, without exception, eventually reaches. It doesn't matter how you lived, how you died, or what you believed. There are no alternate paths, no secret shortcuts. Everyone ends up there, and the strange part is, you don't arrive the way you would normally think. There's no clear moment where you say, oh, I'm here now. Instead, it's more like the world around you slowly reshapes itself until you realize you're already standing at the edge of it. Now picture this carefully, because the way they described it is surprisingly vivid. The river isn't loud or violent. It doesn't crash or roar. In fact, it moves slowly, almost unnaturally slow, like time itself has thickened. The water is dark, not just in color, but in feeling. It reflects nothing, no sky, no light, no sense of depth, just a surface that seems to absorb everything. And here's something that might catch you off guard. The Greeks didn't imagine this place as chaotic or crowded in a noisy. Wit was quiet, almost too quiet. You could see others there, other souls like you, but no one was really talking. Some stared at the water, some looked lost, some just stood there, as if they had been waiting longer than they could remember. That silence, that shared understanding that everyone had reached the same point, that's what made it unsettling. Not fear, not panic, just a kind of stillness that feels heavier the longer you stay in it. And this is where things get even more interesting, because not all rivers in the Greek underworld were the same. There were several each with its own meaning, its own purpose, but the one most people talk about is the one you're standing in front of now, the one that separates the world of the living from everything that comes after. And here's the shocking part. This river wasn't just a location, it was a boundary that could not be crossed freely. You couldn't swim it, you couldn't walk around it, you couldn't find another way. It was absolute, and that idea alone says a lot about how the Greeks viewed death not as something you could negotiate with, not as something you could escape through cleverness or strength, but as a line that, once reached, changed everything permanently. And the more you think about it, the more it starts to feel less like a myth, and more like a very human way of trying to understand something we all eventually face. Now imagine standing there, looking at that water, and starting to notice small details, the way it moves without sound, the way it seems deeper than it should be, the way it almost feels like it's aware of you, even though it doesn't react. And then, slowly, you begin to notice something else, movement on the other side. At first, it's hard to make out, just a shape, a shadow, but the longer you look, the clearer it becomes. There's someone there, and even before you fully see it, you already understand what it means. Because here's another unsettling truth from Greek belief. You were never meant to cross this river alone. There is always something waiting to take you across. Not guide you gently, not welcome you, just take you. And that realization changes the feeling of the entire place. It's no longer just a river, it's a waiting point. And this is the moment where anticipation starts to build, even if you don't want it to, because deep down you begin to realize that standing still isn't permanent. You're not meant to stay on this shore forever. Something is coming closer, slowly but steadily, and when it arrives, your journey will continue whether you're ready or not. That's the part the Greeks emphasized again and again. There is no pause button in this process, no time to fully process what's happening. Everything moves forward at its own pace, but always forward. And as that distant figure becomes clearer, as the shape of something like a boat begins to form in the darkness, you start to understand that this quiet moment, this stillness by the river, is only temporary. So now that you're standing there, watching that shape slowly come closer across the water, this is where the story starts to feel a little more real, not dramatic, not explosive, just inevitable. And the closer it gets, the clearer you begin to see it's not just a shadow or a trick of your mind. It's a boat, small, warm, moving without urgency, but never stopping. And standing inside it is a figure that feels strangely out of place, yet completely expected at the same time. And here's something most people don't realize about him. He's not there to comfort you, not there to explain anything, not even there to acknowledge you in a human way. He's just doing his job over and over again for every soul that arrives. And that's the first unsettling detail in this moment. Your death is not unique here. To you, it feels like everything. To him, it's just another crossing. As the boat reaches the shore, there's no announcement, no invitation. It simply stops. And somehow, without being told, you understand what this means. This is your next step. But before anything happens, there's a pause, a small, quiet hesitation that feels heavier than it should. Because this is where one of the most famous and chilling rules of Greek mythology comes into play. You have to pay, not later, not symbolically. Right here, right now. A coin placed with you during burial is meant to be your passage, and this leads to one of the most shocking truths about their beliefs. Your journey after death depends on something as small and simple as a single coin. No wealth, no status, no power from your life carries over. Just that one detail, and if it's missing, everything changes. Because here's what they imagined would happen if you didn't have it. You don't board the boat. You don't cross the river. You stay on that same shore, watching others leave while you remain. And time doesn't work the same way anymore. Days don't pass like days. There's no sunrise, no sunset to measure anything. Just waiting. Endless, quiet waiting. Some stories even suggest that souls without payment could be stuck there for 100 years before being allowed to cross. And think about that for a second. Not punishment in the form of pain, but in the form of delay, being forced to exist in uncertainty, unable to move forward or go back, might have been one of the most feared outcomes in Greek belief. It's not loud, it's not violent, but it slowly wears you down in a way that feels deeply human. Now, assuming you do have the coin, assuming everything was done correctly after your death, the moment finally comes. You step into the boat, and again, nothing dramatic happens. No sudden shift, no magical transformation, just the subtle feeling of leaving something behind, even if you can't fully define what that something is anymore. The boat begins to move, and the shore you are standing on starts to drift away, slowly disappearing into the same kind of vague emptiness you experienced before. And here's another detail that often gets overlooked. The journey across the river isn't quick. It's slow, quiet, almost meditative. You're not distracted by conversation. Charon doesn't speak unless absolutely necessary. There's no reassurance, no explanation of what's coming next, just the sound, or rather, the absence of sound as the boat glides forward through water that doesn't ripple the way it should. And as you sit there, moving steadily across that dark surface, something begins to settle in. Not fear, not panic, but realization. the kind that doesn't hit all at once, but slowly becomes clearer with each passing moment. You're not just traveling to a place, you're crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. And that's the final, quiet shock in this part of the journey. Once you leave that shore behind, you are no longer connected to the world of the living in any meaningful way. There's no return path waiting for you, no second chance hidden somewhere, just forward movement into something unknown, something the Greeks tried to describe but never fully explained. And as the boat continues, as the other side begins to take shape in the distance, you start to understand that this river was never just about distance, it was about separation. So, now you're in the boat, slowly moving across that silent river, and this is where something insignificant in the world of the living suddenly becomes the most important detail in your entire existence. We're talking about a single coin, and I know that sounds almost too simple, right? But in Greek mythology, this tiny object wasn't just a tradition, it was the difference between moving forward or being completely stuck. The Greeks took this so seriously that when someone died, their family would place a coin either in the mouth or over the eyes of the body before burial, not as decoration, not as symbolism, but as a literal payment for the journey you're on right now. And here's the first shocking fact. Your afterlife didn't begin with judgment, it began with a transaction. Before anything else, before you even reached the deeper parts of the underworld, you had to prove you were prepared with something as ordinary as a coin. Now imagine being in that boat, feeling it glide across the water, and realizing that everything happening right now was made possible by someone else's actions after you died. That's what makes this part of the journey so unsettling, because for the Greeks, your fate wasn't entirely in your own hands anymore. It depended on whether the living remembered to do things correctly, whether they honored the rituals, whether they cared enough to send you off properly. And that leads to a deeper, almost uncomfortable thought. Your afterlife could be shaped by other people's mistakes. If your burial was rushed, forgotten, or done incorrectly, you might not even be on this boat right now. You'd still be back there, standing at the edge of the river, watching others leave. And that idea adds a very human layer to the mythics. Not just about death, it's about responsibility between the living and the dead. But let's go a little deeper into that, because it gets more intense the more you think about it. The Greeks believed that souls who weren't properly buried became restless, not violent ghosts like in modern horror stories, but something quieter and more tragic. They wandered, they lingered, they couldn't complete their journey. And here's another shocking detail that often gets overlooked. These souls weren't being punished for something. They were suffering because something wasn't done for them. That's a completely different kind of fear. It's not about guilt, it's about being forgotten. And in a society where memory and honor were everything, that was one of the worst outcomes imaginable. To die, and then not be given the chance to move on properly. It turns the idea of death into something shared between generations, not just an individual experience. Now, back in the boat, there's something else happening that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. As you move further away from the shore, the feeling of connection to your past life continues to fade, not all at once, not like losing your memory instantly, but slowly, like details becoming less sharp over time. Faces blur, names feel distant, emotions soften. And here's where the Greeks introduced another quiet but powerful idea. Crossing the river wasn't just about changing location, it was about changing identity. You weren't the same person anymore, at least not in the way you used to be. You still existed, you still thought, but the ties that defined you in life were loosening with every moment that passed. And the further you went, the harder it became to hold onto them. And this is where the weight of that small coin becomes even more symbolic. even though the Greeks didn't treat it as just a symbol, because, in a strange way, it represents your final connection to the world you left behind. Something physical, something given to you by the living, something that allowed you to take this step forward. Without it, you remain incomplete. With it, you continue but at a cost. Not a financial cost, but a deeper one, because as the boat keeps moving, as the water stretches endlessly around you, you begin to understand something that feels both calm and unsettling at the same time. This journey is designed to slowly separate you from everything you once were, and by the time you reach the other side, you might not even realize how much you've already let go. So, let's stay with that idea for a second, because it's actually more disturbing the longer you think about it. You're sitting in that boat, moving slowly across the river, and everything that's happening right now, this entire transition from life to whatever comes next, depends on something so small it almost feels unfair. A single coin. And here's the part that most people don't expect. The Greeks didn't see this as strange or cruel. They saw it as normal. In their world, passage always required preparation, and that leads to a quiet but powerful realization. Death wasn't just something that happened to you. It was something you had to be prepared for, even after you were gone. If no one prepared you, if no one followed the ritual, your journey didn't just get delayed, it stopped completely. And when you think about that, it changes the way you see everything that's happening in this moment. Because now, as the boat moves forward, there's a subtle sense of relief mixed with something else, something heavier, the understanding that you were lucky enough to make it this far. But let's talk about the ones who didn't, because this is where the myth becomes less about movement and more about absence. Back on that shore you left behind, there are still souls waiting, not loudly crying, not screaming for help, just existing in a kind of quiet suspension. And here's the shocking part. They are fully aware of what they're missing. They can see the boat come and go. They can watch others step forward, pay their coin and disappear into the distance, while they remain exactly where they are. No progress, no change, just waiting. And the Greeks believed this waiting could last for an incredibly long time, sometimes described as 100 years, sometimes even longer, depending on the version of the story. But here's the thing that really makes it unsettling. Time doesn't feel normal there. So it's not just a long wait, it's an undefined one. You don't know when it ends, you don't know if it ends, and that uncertainty becomes its own kind of quiet torment. Now, as your boat continues forward, something else begins to shift inside you. It's subtle at first, almost easy to ignore. Your thoughts feel slower, not dull, not empty, just less urgent. The things that once felt incredibly important start to lose their intensity. And here comes another surprising idea from Greek mythology. The journey across the river isn't just physical, it's psychological. It's designed, in a way, to prepare you for what comes next by slowly softening your attachment to your past life. That doesn't mean you forget everything immediately. It's not like your memories are erased, but they begin to feel distant, like stories you heard a long time ago, rather than experiences you lived yourself. And the longer you sit there, surrounded by silence, the more natural that feeling becomes. It's not forced, it just happens.com. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some ancient stories suggest that the river itself plays a role in this transformation, not actively, not in a conscious way, but as part of the environment. Just being near it, just crossing it, begins to change how you think and feel. And that leads to one of the more subtle but fascinating, shocking facts. The Greeks didn't believe memory stayed perfectly intact after death. They believed it faded, shifted, or even disappeared, depending on where you went next. which means the person you were in life might not fully exist in the same way after this journey. And if you think about that for a moment, it raises a strange question. If your memories fade, if your identity slowly changes, are you still the same person? Or are you becoming something else entirely without even realizing it? And as that thought settles in, as the boat keeps moving and the other side begins to feel closer, there's one final realization that quietly takes shape. The coin you paid, it didn't just buy you passage across a river. It bought you entry into a process of transformation that has already begun and cannot be reversed. Because here's the final, almost hidden truth in this part of the journey. Once you've crossed halfway, you're no longer just someone who died. You're something in between what you were and what you're about to become. And there's no moment where that shift is announced. No clear line where you can say, this is where I changed. It happens gradually, silently, just like everything else in this world. And by the time you reach the other side, you might not even notice how much of you has already been left behind. So, after that long, quiet crossing, something starts to change again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but you can feel it. The boat slows down. The water, which felt endless just moments ago, now seems to have a direction, an endpoint. And as you look ahead, you begin to see shapes forming out of the darkness. At first, it's vague, just outlines, but slowly it becomes clearer structures, shadows, something that feels built rather than natural. And this is where your journey in Greek mythology takes another step deeper, because what you're approaching now isn't just land, it's an entrance, not welcoming, not guarded in a loud or aggressive way, but undeniably significant. The kind of place where you instinctively understand. Once you pass through, everything changes again. As the boat comes closer, the details begin to settle into place. Massive gates, old beyond anything you've ever seen. Not broken, not ruined, just ancient, like they've existed for longer than memory itself. And here's something interesting. The Greeks didn't describe these gates as decorated or beautiful. There's no gold, no shining surface, nothing that tries to impress you. Instead, they're plain, heavy, and absolute. And that simplicity is what makes them feel so final, because it tells you something without saying a word. This place doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't need to welcome you. It simply exists as the next step in a process that has already begun. And here's the first shocking detail about this moment. You are not invited to enter. You are expected to. There's a difference, and you can feel it the closer you get. Now imagine stepping off the boat. The ground feels different. Not soft, not hard, just unfamiliar, like it doesn't belong to the same world you came from. The air is still, but heavier somehow, and as you stand there, facing those gates, you might expect something to happen. A voice, a signal, some kind of instruction, but nothing comes. And that silence does something subtle but powerful. It forces you to act without guidance. You take a step forward, not because someone told you to, but because there's nothing else to do. And this leads to another unsettling idea. The Greeks believed the afterlife doesn't guide you with clarity, it moves you forward through inevitability. You don't always know what's happening, but you keep going anyway. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The gates themselves aren't just symbolic. They represent a boundary between two completely different states of existence. Before the gates, you're still transitioning, you're still adjusting, still holding onto pieces of your past. But beyond them, that's where things become more defined, more structured, more permanent. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because once you pass through, you're no longer arriving, you're inside. And here's the shocking part. There's no record in these myths of anyone casually turning around at this point. not because they physically couldn't, but because by the time you reach this stage, the idea of going back doesn't even feel like an option anymore. It's not fear stopping you, it's something deeper, like your mind has already accepted what's happening. And as you move closer, as those gates stand right in front of you now, there's one final detail that often gets overlooked that says everything about how the Greeks saw this world. There are no guards shouting commands, no dramatic challenge, no test at the entrance, just presence, stillness, and the quiet understanding that crossing this threshold is part of something much larger than you, and that leads to the final realization in this moment. This place doesn't react to you, you adjust to it, not the other way around. And as you take that final step, as you begin to pass through those massive, silent gates, you start to feel it clearly now. Whatever you were before is already becoming something else. So now you've crossed the threshold, and if you were expecting something dramatic the moment you stepped through those gates, this is where the story quietly surprises you again, because nothing explodes, nothing shifts suddenly. Instead, everything feels almost the same but slightly off, and that slightly off feeling is what defines this place. The space beyond the gates in Greek mythology isn't chaotic or loud, it's structured, but in a way that doesn't feel alive. The ground stretches out endlessly, the air stays still, and the sense of direction becomes less reliable. You can walk, you can move, but it doesn't feel like you're getting closer or farther from anything in a normal way. And here's the first shocking fact about this part of the journey. Distance doesn't behave the way you expect it to anymore. You're no longer in a world where steps equal progress. Movement exists, but purpose becomes harder to define. And the more you stand there, the more you start noticing something subtle but deeply unsettling. You're not alone, but no one is interacting the way people normally would. There are other souls here, scattered across this vast space, but they don't greet you, they don't ask questions, they don't even seem curious about your presence. Some are walking slowly, some standing still, some just existing. And this leads to another quiet realization. The Greeks embedded into their vision of the underworld. After death, individuality becomes less expressive, not gone, not erased, but softened. People don't behave the way they did in life. Emotions don't show in the same way. Conversations aren't a natural part of this place. And that creates a kind of loneliness that feels different from being physically alone. It's not about the absence of people. It's about the absence of connection. Now, as your eyes adjust to this environment, you begin to notice the scale of where you are. This isn't a small, contained space. It's vast, far beyond what you can fully see or understand, and somewhere within this endless realm exists a presence that defines everything here, even if you don't encounter it directly right away. The ruler of this place, Hades. But here's something that often surprises people. Hades wasn't imagined as cruel or chaotic. He wasn't constantly punishing souls or actively controlling every movement. Instead, he represented something much more stable and, in a way, more unsettling. He was the embodiment of order within death. Everything here functioned because of that order, not loudly, not aggressively, but completely. And that means the system you've entered isn't random. It's structured in a way you don't fully understand yet. And here comes another detail that makes this place feel even more different from the world you left behind. There's no clear sense of time, no sun, no shadows shifting, no markers that tell you how long you've been standing there or how long you've been walking. And this leads to one of the more fascinating and slightly disturbing ideas in Greek belief. Time in the underworld isn't something you experience the same. Wait's something that almost stops mattering. You're not counting minutes or hours anymore. You're just existing. And when time loses its meaning, something else changes with it. Urgency disappears. The need to rush, to decide quickly, to act immediately, fades. And while that might sound peaceful at first, it also removes something very human. Because without time, there's no sense of progress, no before and after in the way you're used to. And as all of this begins to settle in, as you stand there or slowly move forward without really knowing where you're going, there's one final realization that quietly takes hold. You're no longer in a transitional space like the river. You're not on your way anymore. You're here, and this place, with its silence, its structure, and its strange stillness, is now part of your existence. And that leads to the final, shocking truth of this moment. Entering the underworld doesn't feel like arriving somewhere new. It feels like realizing you've already been absorbed into something that was always waiting. There's no welcoming moment, no clear beginning, just the slow understanding that whatever comes next will happen here. So, now that you've stepped fully into this place, something else begins to make itself known, not immediately, not in a way that startles you, but slowly, like a presence you feel before you actually see it. And this is where the underworld in Greek mythology introduces one of its most famous, and honestly, most misunderstood figures, because when people hear about a guardian in a place like this, they imagine something aggressive, something constantly attacking or chasing anything that moves. But that's not how it works here. Instead, what you're about to encounter is something far more controlled, far more patient, a presence that doesn't need to prove its power because everything around you already follows its rules. And the strange part is, before you even see it clearly, you already understand what it represents. A boundary that cannot be undone. Now imagine walking forward, not in a straight line, but in that slow, directionless way you've started to get used to, and then noticing something ahead that doesn't blend into the background like everything else. It's still, not empty stillness, like the rest of this place, but intentional stillness. And as you get closer, the shape becomes clearer, larger, more defined, until you finally see it for what it is, Cerberus. And here's the first shocking truth about him: he's not there to attack you when you enter. He's there to make sure you never leave. That completely flips the way most people think about this creature. He's not guarding the entrance to keep souls out. He's guarding it to keep them in. And that changes the entire feeling of his presence. It's not about fear in the moment, it's about permanence. And the more you observe him, the more unsettling that realization becomes. Because Cerberus isn't constantly moving or reacting. He doesn't chase every soul. He doesn't need to. His existence alone is enough. Massive, steady, aware in a way that feels deeper than just physical sight. And here's something that often gets overlooked. The Greeks didn't describe him as chaotic or wild. They described him as part of the system, just like the river, just like the gates. He exists as a function, not an emotion. And that means there's no convincing him, no tricking him in a normal sense, no appealing to him the way you might try with a human guard. He doesn't get bored, he doesn't get distracted, he simply remains exactly where he needs to be. Now this leads to a deeper, more psychological kind of fear net, the kind that makes you run, but the kind that settles in your mind quietly. Because once you understand what Cerberus represents, you start to see the full picture. The river separated you from the world of the living. The gates brought you into this new realm. But this is what ensures there's no reversal. And here's the next shocking fact. The Greeks didn't focus on escape from the underworld as something normal. treated it as nearly impossible, almost unnatural. Stories of people leaving exist, but they're rare, complicated, and almost always end in failure or consequence. And Cerberus is one of the main reasons why, not because he's constantly fighting, but because his presence makes the idea of leaving feel wrong. And as you stand there, taking all of this in, there's one final detail that really defines this moment. You don't feel the urge to challenge him. You don't feel the need to test the boundary, because something inside you already understands what he represents. And that's what makes this part of the journey so powerful. It's not about being forced to stay. It's about realizing that staying is now the only reality that makes sense. And that leads to the final quiet truth of this encounter. Cerberus doesn't just guard the underworld physically, he reinforces it mentally. His presence doesn't just stop you from leaving it, removes the expectation that leaving is even possible. And once that idea settles in, everything about this place starts to feel a little more permanent than before. So, now that you've seen him really seen him, there's this quiet shift in how you understand everything around you. Before, the underworld felt like a place you were moving through, step by step, almost like a journey with stages. But standing near Cerberus changes that feeling, because suddenly it's no longer about where you're going next. It's about where you cannot go anymore. And that's a subtle but powerful difference. You don't need him to growl or threaten you to feel it. His presence alone makes one thing clear. The direction you came from is closed. And here's the first shocking truth in this part: finality in the underworld isn't enforced through action, it's enforced through certainty. You just know. No announcement, no rule book, no explanation, just a deep, quiet understanding that this boundary isn't meant to be crossed again. And the longer you remain in this space, the more that understanding settles into something deeper than just a thought. It becomes part of how you perceive everything. You stop thinking about before in the same way. The world you came from starts to feel less like a place you could return to, and more like something that already belongs to a different version of you. And that leads to another unsettling idea from Greek mythology. The underworld doesn't just separate you, it reshapes your sense of belonging. You don't feel trapped in the way you might expect. You don't feel like you're being held against your will. Instead, you slowly begin to feel like this is where you're supposed to be now. And that's what makes it so effective, because once your mind accepts that, there's no need for force. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, especially if you think about the rare stories where someone tried to leave. There are a few, very few where individuals managed to pass Cerberus or move beyond him. But here's the part most people don't realize. Those stories almost always involve something unnatural. Music that bends emotion, divine intervention, or very specific conditions that break the normal rules. And even then, they don't end cleanly. That leads to one of the more chilling, shocking facts in these myths. Escaping the underworld was never meant to be a normal outcome. It was treated as a disruption of the natural order, and because of that, it almost always came with consequences. Not necessarily immediate punishment, but something that made the escape incomplete or temporary, which tells you a lot about how seriously the Greeks viewed this boundary. It wasn't just difficult to cross, it wasn't supposed to be crossed at all. And as you stand there, or slowly move past that threshold where Cerberus exists, something else begins to change in a very subtle way. Your awareness of outside starts to fade, not completely, not instantly, but gradually. The idea of the world above becomes less detailed, less vivid. And here's another quiet but powerful detail. The underworld doesn't erase your past, it simply makes it less relevant over time. You don't forget who you were all at once. You don't lose your memories like flipping a switch. but they begin to feel distant, like stories that no longer require your attention. And that shift is important because it allows everything here to feel more stable, more normal, even if it's completely different from what you once knew. It's not that this place changes to fit you, it's that you slowly change to fit it. And this brings you to the final realization of this moment, one that doesn't hit all at once, but builds quietly in the background of everything you're experiencing. The presence of Cerberus wasn't just about guarding a gate or enforcing a rule, it was about defining a state of existence. Before him, you were transitioning. After him, you're settled weather. You fully accept it yet or not, and that leads to the final shocking truth here. The moment you understand you can't leave is the moment the underworld truly begins to feel like your reality. Not because it changed, but because you did. So, by this point, something inside you has already started to settle. Even if you haven't fully realized it yet, you're no longer arriving, no longer adjusting to the idea of where you are. Now, you're moving deeper into something more structured, something that feels less like a place and more like a process. And this is where Greek mythology introduces one of its most important moments, not loud, not dramatic, but absolutely defining: judgment. But here's the part that might surprise you right away. This isn't the kind of judgment most people imagine. There's no crowd watching, no public declaration, no emotional speech about your life. Instead, it's quiet, personal, almost indifferent. And that's what makes it so unsettling, because when there's no emotion guiding the process, there's nothing to appeal to. Now imagine being guided, Dogen, not by force, but by that same quiet inevitability toward a space that feels slightly different from the rest of the underworld. Not brighter, not darker, just more focused. And there, waiting, are figures who don't need introduction. Even if you've never seen them before, they don't look threatening, they don't raise their voices, they simply exist with a kind of calm authority that feels impossible to question. These are the judges of the dead figures like Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Ea. And here's the first shocking truth about them: they don't need to ask you what you did in life. They already know, not through interrogation, not through evidence presented in front of you, but as if your life is already visible, already understood, without explanation. And that changes everything about how this moment feels, because normally, when we think about being judged, we imagine defending ourselves, explaining our choices, giving context to our actions. But here, none of that happens. There's no argument, no chance to clarify misunderstandings. And that leads to a very uncomfortable realization. Your life, as it was, is already completing. Nothing you say now can change how it seems. It's not about what you meant to do, or what you almost did, or what you wish you had done. It's about what actually happened. And that kind of clarity, that kind of finality, removes something very human: the ability to negotiate your own story. Now here's where the process becomes even more interesting, because despite how serious this moment is, it's not chaotic or overwhelming, it's incredibly simple. Each soul is evaluated, and then directed, not punished immediately, not rewarded with celebration, just sent where they belong. And this brings us to another shocking fact. Judgment in the Greek underworld wasn't about emotional justice. It was about placement. You are assigned a place that matches the life you live. That's it. No dramatic transformation. No sudden change in who you are. Just a continuation of existence in a space that reflects your past. And because of that, the process feels less like a trial and more like a sorting. And as you stand there, as that decision is made quietly, without ceremony, you begin to feel something that's hard to describe. Not fear, not relief, something in between, because deep down, even before anything is said or shown, You already have a sense of where you're going, and that leads to the final, almost unsettling truth of this moment. Judgment doesn't reveal something new about you. It confirms something you already knew, even if you never admitted it. And that's what makes it so powerful, not the decision itself, but the realization that comes with it. So, once that quiet decision is made, no speech, no explanation, just that subtle shift where you know it's done something else begins to happen. And it's almost more unsettling than the judgment itself, because there's no reaction from the judges, no sign that anything significant just took place. Figures like Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus don't celebrate outcomes or show disappointment. They simply continue, and that leads to the first shocking realization here. Your judgment is incredibly important to you, but to the system, it's just another completed step. There's no emotional weight placed on it from their side, no pause to acknowledge what your life meant, and that creates a strange contrast because for you, this moment defines everything that comes next, but for them, it's routine. Now imagine standing there, even for just a moment after that decision, and realizing something subtle has changed not around you, but within you. That sense of uncertainty you carried since the moment you left your body, it's gone, not replaced by comfort, not replaced by fear, just gone, and in its place is something much more stable, direction. And here's where Greek mythology introduces another idea that people don't usually expect. Judgment doesn't confuse you, it clarifies you. You don't question the result, you don't argue internally, you understand it completely, even if it's not what you would have chosen for yourself while you were alive. And that's what makes it so powerful. It doesn't force agreement, it creates it. And then, without any dramatic signal, you begin to move again, not guided by a visible hand, not escorted in a way that feels controlled, but drawn just like before. Except this time, it feels more defined, less wandering, more intentional. And this is where the Underworld reveals another, one of its quieter but deeply unsettling truths. Once you've been judged, your path is no longer open set. There are no branching choices ahead, no unexpected turns, no possibility of changing direction. Whatever comes next is exactly what your life has already aligned you with, and that realization changes the feeling of movement itself. Before, you were exploring something unknown. Now, you're entering something already decided. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, especially when you think about how different this is from modern ideas of judgment. There's no concept here of sudden redemption, no last-minute shift that changes everything, and that leads to one of the most striking, shocking facts in this entire process. In the Greek view of the afterlife, what you consistently did mattered more than what you intended to be, not your potential, not your plans, not your regrets, just your actions, repeated over time. And because of that, the outcome feels less like a surprise and more like a reflection, almost like looking into something that shows you your life exactly as it was, without distortion. And once you see it that clearly, there's nothing left to question. And as you continue forward, as the space around you begins to subtly shift to match whatever destination you've been assigned, there's one final realization that settles in quietly but completely. The process of judgment didn't change you, it revealed you. And that leads to the final truth of this moment. The Underworld doesn't decide who you are, it simply places you where you already belong. And once that placement begins to take shape around you, once the environment itself starts to reflect that decision, you start to understand something that feels both calm and deeply final at the same time. This isn't the end of your story, it's the continuation of it, in a form you can no longer rewrite. So, now that judgment is behind you, This is where something really strange begins to settle in, and honestly, it's not what most people expect. Because when we think about the afterlife, we usually imagine something dramatic, reward, punishment, something intense or emotional. But in Greek mythology, for most souls, it's neither of those things. It's something quieter, something slower, something that, over time, becomes almost impossible to measure. And that's where you are now, not in a moment of decision anymore, but in a state of continuation. And here's the first shocking truth. For the majority of souls, the afterlife wasn't about suffering. It was about existing, just existing. No clear goal, no progression, no ending. And that might not sound scary at first, until you really sit with what that means. Now imagine moving through this space that's been shaped by the outcome of your life. Not dramatically different from what you've already seen, but more settled, more consistent. The environment doesn't shift unpredictably anymore. It stays the same, and at first, that might even feel calming. There's no urgency, no pressure, no need to rush or decide anything. But here's where it starts to get a little unsettling. Nothing changes, not in the way you're used to. There are no new events, no new opportunities, no sense that something is building toward anything else. And the longer you remain in that kind of stillness, the more noticeable it becomes. Because, as humans, we're used to movement, to progress, to time pushing us forward. But here, that push is gone. And this is where one of the most overlooked aspects of the Greek afterlife reveals itself. It wasn't designed to be exciting. It wasn't even designed to be meaningful in the way we think of meaning. It was designed to be stable. And that leads to another surprising realization. Stability, when stretched out endlessly, starts to feel very different from peace. At first, it's quiet, then it's calm, but eventually, it becomes something else, something harder to describe, because without change, without contrast, even the idea of feeling good starts to fade. There's nothing to compare it to anymore, and that's what makes this state so unique. It's not painful, but it's not fulfilling either. It simply is. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, especially when you think about identity. Earlier, we talked about how your memories and sense of self begin to shift during the journey, and in this stage, that process continues, but in a much more subtle way. You don't suddenly forget who you are, but over time, the details become less important. The emotional weight of your past life softens, and here's the shocking part. You don't miss it the way you think you would, not because it wasn't important, but because your connection to it has changed. It's like remembering something from a long time ago that once meant everything to you, but now feels distant, almost neutral. And the longer you exist in this state, the more natural that feeling becomes. And as all of this settles in, as you move on, maybe just remain in this endless, unchanging existence, there's one final realization that begins to take shape. It doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, quietly, almost in the background of your awareness. And that realization is this. This isn't a phase. This is the default. There's no next step waiting, no transition coming, no moment where everything shifts again. This is what most souls experience for however long forever. Actually feels in a place where time doesn't really exist. And that's what makes it so powerful in a very quiet way. Not fear, not pain, just the understanding that what you're experiencing now is what continues. So, if you stay in that state long enough, and remember, long enough doesn't really mean anything, here you begin to notice something even stranger than the stillness itself. It's not just that nothing changes around you, it's that your reaction to it stops changing too. At first, there was curiosity, maybe even a quiet sense of observation, like you were still trying to understand where you are. But over time, that fades, and this is where Greek mythology introduces one of its most subtle but unsettling ideas. The afterlife doesn't just remove urgency, it slowly removes the need to question anything at all. You're not searching for answers anymore, not because you found them, but because the need to search has quietly disappeared, and when that happens, your entire experience of existence shifts into something flatter. Now imagine looking around at the other souls again. They're still there, always have been, always will be, but just like you, they're not really interacting in a meaningful way. No conversations that build, no relationships forming, no shared goals. And here's the shocking part that most people overlook. The Greek afterlife wasn't designed for connection. It was designed for continuation. That's a huge difference. Because in life, so much of what gives meaning comes from interaction, from growth, from change between people. But here, none of that develops further. It's not taken away violently, it just never evolves. And the longer you exist in that kind of environment, the more natural it starts to feel. Not satisfying, not empty, just normal. And this leads to something even deeper, something that's easy to miss if you're only thinking about the surface of these myths. Over time, your sense of before and after doesn't just blurt, it becomes irrelevant. You stop comparing your current state to your past life, because there's no reason to. And here's another quiet but powerful truth. When comparison disappears, so does the idea of loss. That's what makes this so different from how we usually imagine eternity. You don't sit there missing your old life forever. You don't replay memories over and over in a painful loop. Instead, those memories simply lose their importance, not erased, just no longer central to your experience. And that changes everything, because without loss, without longing, without desire, what you're left with is something incredibly neutral. But neutrality, when it stretches endlessly, starts to feel like something else entirely. Not discomfort, not suffering, but a kind of quiet detachment from everything, including yourself. And this is where one of the most interesting, shocking facts comes in. The Greeks didn't describe most souls as happy or sad. They described them as shades, not fully alive, not fully gone, just existing in a diminished state of awareness and presence. And when you really think about that, it's not meant to be terrifying in a loud way. It's meant to reflect something deeper about how they saw existence. After death, not as an extension of life's intensity, but as a soft, gradual fading of it. And the more time passes, or whatever replaces time here, the more complete that fading becomes. And as all of this settles into place, as you move or remaining this endless, quiet continuation, there's one final realization that gently closes in around the experience. You're no longer waiting for something to happen, not because you're patient, but because there's nothing coming. And that leads to the final, almost hidden truth of this stage. The afterlife, for most souls, wasn't about what happens next. It was about what stops happening altogether. No more change, no more becoming, just being. And in a strange, almost peaceful way, once that fully settles in, it doesn't feel unsettling anymore. It just feels complete. So, after everything you've settled into the stillness, the quiet continuation, the feeling that nothing really changes anymore, you probably assume that's it, right? That this is the final state, the permanent condition, the end of all movement. And for almost everyone in Greek mythology, that's exactly true. But every once in a while, in the stories the Greeks told, something unusual happens. Not common, not expected, not even encouraged, just rare. There are moments, very few, where a soul doesn't simply remain where it belongs. Moments where someone tries to go back. And here's the first shocking truth. about that idea. The Greeks didn't treat return from the underworld as a hopeful possibility. They treated it as something unnatural, not impossible, but something that disrupts the order of everything you've experienced so far. Now imagine being in that endless, neutral state we just talked about, where nothing really pushes you to act anymore. No urgency, no strong desire, no sense of I need to do something. And then suddenly, something changes, not outside, not dramatically, but inside. A feeling you haven't experienced in a long time starts to come back. A pull, a memory that feels stronger than the others. And that's where these rare stories begin, because in almost every case where someone attempts to return, it's not random. It's driven by something very specific: loss or unfinished connection. And this is where one of the most famous examples comes in: Orpheus, a figure whose story isn't about strength or power, but about persistence. And here's the shocking part. He didn't try to escape for himself. He tried to bring someone else back. And that changes the tone of everything immediately. Because up until now, the underworld has been about acceptance, about inevitability, about moving forward without resistance. But stories like this introduce something different: resistance itself. And here's where it gets interesting. The underworld doesn't react with chaos when that resistance appears. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't break apart. Instead, it responds in a very controlled, very specific way. It allows the attempt, but under conditions. And that leads to another surprising truth in these myths. Even breaking the rules follows a rule. You're not just escaping, you're given a chance. But that chance comes with a test so precise that failing, it feels almost unavoidable. Now think about what that says about how the Greeks understood human nature. They didn't create stories where people simply outsmart, death, or overpower the system. They created stories where the challenge wasn't physical. It was internal, patience, trust, restraint. And here's the next shocking fact. Most attempts to leave the underworld fail not because the path is blocked, but because the person cannot maintain control over themselves. That's what makes these stories feel so real, even now. It's not about fighting monsters or breaking barriers. It's about facing something much more difficult. Your own doubt, your own fear, your own instinct to look back, to question, to hesitate. And as this idea settles in, as you imagine what it would take to even consider leaving a place like this after everything you've already experienced, there's one final realization that begins to take shape. The underworld isn't just a place that holds you. Physically, it's a place that changes how you think, how you feel, how you decide. And that leads to the final truth of this moment. By the time someone tries to leave, they're no longer the same person who entered. And that makes the attempt itself even more fragile, because it's not just about finding a way out. It's about holding on to something that this place has already started to take away. So, when you step back and look at all of this, the slow fading of the body, the silent river, the crossing with Charon, the gates, the stillness, the judgment, and everything that follows, you start to realize something important. In Greek mythology, death was never imagined as a sudden ending. It was a process, a gradual shift, a journey that didn't rush, didn't explain, and didn't need to. And maybe that's why it feels so strangely real, because it mirrors something we all understand deep down, the idea that not everything ends all at once. And the more you think about it, the more it becomes less about fear and more about understanding how the ancient Greeks tried to make sense of something they couldn't control. They didn't imagine a loud, chaotic afterlife filled with constant action. They imagined something quieter, something slower, a place where everything eventually settles into stillness, where even memory softens, and where existence continues, just in a different way. And honestly, There's something almost calming about that. Not comforting in a simple way, but calming in the sense that everything, no matter how intense it feels in life, eventually becomes still. So tonight, as you lie there, maybe a little more relaxed now, maybe drifting just a bit closer to sleep, just picture that river one last time, the surface unmoving, the boat gliding slowly across, no urgency, no noise, just motion, steady and quiet, and somewhere in that stillness, there's a kind of peace, not because everything is solved, but because nothing is rushing anymore. And maybe that's the real reason these stories were told, not to scare people, not even to warn them, but to give shape to the unknown, to turn something invisible into something you could imagine, follow, and eventually accept. Because when something has a shape, even if it's mysterious, it becomes a little less overwhelming. So just let your thoughts slow down now, let everything fade gently into the background, and like that quiet journey across the river, just drift a little further into rest.